You're very welcome to this webinar, introducing IFR4NPO. We hope that you'll leave with a new perspective on financial reporting challenges experienced by different stakeholders, that you'll have a clearer understanding of how the guidance will be developed and how it could affect you. And hopefully you'll leave ready to engage and ensure your voice is heard in the development process. So my name is Samantha Musoke. I'm the IFR4NPO Project Director for Humentum based in Uganda. And I'm joined today by Tim Boyes-Watson, who's the Global Director of Alliances and Advocacy at Humentum, who's been a staunch advocate for NPO financial reporting standards for more than a decade, and Karen Sanderson, who's the IFR4NPO Project Lead at the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy. Please do use the chat to raise any questions or comments that you may have as we go along, and we'll have time to speak to those at the end. We'll also be conducting some polls, and we do look forward to your participation and engagement throughout. And we'd be grateful if you could keep your microphone on mute and your video off, which will help us with the broadband issues. So Tim, I'll hand back to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Sam. I'm sorry I'm having a few technical issues of my own this morning, so please bear with me. Yeah, Sam, actually, could you take it just for a minute while I get something sorted here?
Certainly. So it'd be super if all of you on this webinar would think about your biggest challenge in preparing or using general purpose financial reports for non-profits, and just write something in the chat. Is it to do with consolidation, or is it to do with expenditure analysis, or whatever it is? What are the challenges that you have either in preparing or in using general purpose financial reports? You could just put one idea and your country in the chat. That would really be helpful. Thank you. I'll give you a minute to do that. It might be grant income recognition or asset capitalization or consolidation. I don't know. Ah, here's one. Great. Thank you, MKU. Thank you, James. So we've got variance analysis, identifying ineligible expenses, where to put them, allocating expenses to different projects, differing formats, and the statement naming. The schedules don't add value. That's in Uganda. John in Uganda. No standards. Each donor has their reporting guidelines. So there's differences with different donors and just needing different formats for each donor. Advanced skill in Excel. We have maybe have our data in our ledgers, but then we end up doing so much work outside our accounting system in Excel, which obviously is time consuming, error prone, and requires a lot of skill. In Cambodia, we have lack of government guidelines. So there's no national standards, so different formats. Agnes from Belgium, comparison, quality, depth of comparison, because you're getting reports from lots of different countries as a user, I'm guessing, is that Agnes? You see them in lots of different formats. So absolutely, these are some of the challenges that we've been hearing from stakeholders around the world as well. So thank you for sharing those. Tim, do you want to take it from here? I'll keep going. So some of the, so just to build on what you've said, some of the things that we've heard from different stakeholders over the last few years, really, while we've been working on this, is that donors talk about difficulty in understanding grantee reports from countries that lack national guidance. And that in turn slows down their due diligence processes and slows down the grant making process, which isn't good for anyone. We've been hearing that the international financial reporting standards, the IFRS or even IPSAS, don't provide guidance on some of the key aspects that non-profits need to use when they're preparing their accounts, like accounting for grant income, or knowing how to present restricted funds when you've got money that's for a certain purpose. How do you demonstrate those different projects, those different restricted funds on the face of in the financial statements. And then we've also been hearing that the needs of some donors sometimes are incompatible with IFRS needs. So one of the things that we hear quite often is this issue of asset capitalization. The donors need the assets written off or expensed, while IFRS requires capitalization of assets, and similar sort of ways where you can't see how you can meet the needs of both easily. And then from auditors, we hear this challenge that there's not really a framework for auditors to define true and fair view. So we get a lot of inconsistency. And then from international organizations with branches everywhere, we hear about consolidation challenges. So there's just a handful really of some of the challenges that we've been hearing, which resonates with some of the things that you've mentioned as well. Should we go to the next slide? So in summary, there's a lot of problems with the status quo and where we are at the moment. So there's three different main types of stakeholders that have been a part of make up part of the NPO, the non-profit sector. The first stakeholder group really would be the preparers, the NPOs themselves, preparers of financial reports. And some of the challenges that we've heard from them relate to no guidance, the donor requirements conflicting, duplication of audits, and due diligence. So they might be receiving due diligence visits from multiple donors. Tim, I don't know if you're able to move the slide along. We've heard from users of the general purpose reports, like donors and regulators, even service recipients or beneficiaries or clients, however you call them, and the public. And users find it hard to assess the financial health and capacity of organizations and their financial results because of this lack of consistency and comparability, which Agnes mentioned. And auditors, as we've mentioned, struggle to, these independent assurance providers, they struggle to have an applicable framework to define true and fair view. So we have inconsistent treatment. And I think what this really shows is that the public and private sectors have really benefited from having international frameworks since the 1970s. It's been building up over the last 30, 40 years. And really it's extraordinary that the non-profit sector, we don't have an equivalent, and we're feeling the pains associated with that. I should mention that it's more problematic in countries that lack their own national guidance. So even the various national standards that do exist in some countries are different from each other, and those countries that don't have anything are really feeling that pain, which we're hearing from our members in the chat in Uganda. So these are really challenges that have been around in the sector for a long time, and we're feeling them even more in this COVID-19 period, where the challenges of getting funds to the front line are being really felt. Thank you, Tim. Should we move to the next slide? So one of the things that we're focusing in this webinar is the IFR4NPO guidance. And we believe that this guidance can really be part of the solution to solving some of these challenges that have been talked about. So right now, the present situation, our current state is no international standards for NPOs, inconsistent reports, all these things we've been talking about, duplication of audits, inefficiency, multiple reports going out. And we believe that this guidance can really be part of the solution. So the guidance that we're talking about here is guidance that will be internationally applicable. And it's really guidance, I want to make sure we're talking about general purpose financial reports here. So special reports that go to donors are a different animal, if you like, and we actually have another project that's working on harmonizing those. But this project is focusing on getting a standardized way to present the general purpose financial statements, which is a really important starting point. And we believe that once that guidance is developed and adopted and widely used and accepted as best practice, we will really see a better future. better due diligence that's focused on financial statements that really give donors the information that they want. Can also be supplemented by other aspects, but that's a real core from the financial side. Stronger audit assurance, less waste, easier compliance. And we often hear people saying this guidance would make our lives easier. And that's really what we want. And ultimately, a more resilient and accountable sector. As we felt in this COVID-19 period, this sector is incredibly important for the functioning of the healthy functioning of society. So we need a resilient and accountable sector. And we believe this guidance is a key to unlocking that. It's one piece of a big jigsaw, but a very important piece. So, do you want to move on, Tim? Thank you. So that is all very well in theory, and we can see that in theory there is very good ground for having this guidance, but we also have tangible evidence that people want it from all over the world. So there's a survey done back in 2014, and you can see here there were respondents, over 600 respondents from 179 countries. You can see the pie chart shows that's a really quite representative sampling of opinions from all over the world. And out of that, 72% agreed or strongly agreed that an international standard for NPOs would be useful. So we do know that there really is strong evidence for demand, and that this isn't just a theoretical need, it's something that really people want. Thank you, Tim. So I think there's a very important reason why we need these standards. It could feel like standards is not a particularly exciting thing to get very excited about. Why are standards so important? But I am incredibly excited about the power of standards. We just need to look at the benefits that have been brought from the private sector IFRS and in the public sector with IPSAS. So in the private sector, the corporate sector, the business sector, international accounting standards have been available since the 70s. And they started in the 1973 with the formation of the International Accounting Standards Council, and then later the IFRS Foundation was formed in 2001. So, and now that a really significant number of countries have adopted or aligned to IFRS, the tremendous benefits are being seen for the capital markets that rely on that information. We're seeing, this is just a study done in 2017, we can see that more people read and use the financial reports because they're more meaningful. And this results in more money flowing into the markets, including international flows, more access to finance. Now, wouldn't that be fantastic for our sector to have more people reading the financial statements of nonprofits because they're more meaningful, building confidence, more money flows. In the public sector, we can see it's actually a bit more recent. IPSAS started in the 1990s. So far, 19 countries use IPSAS, but there's a very fast movement at the moment with many, many countries looking to take it up in the next few years. So 72 more countries are looking to be basing their accounting standards for their government reports on IPSAS by 2023. And we'll see that the benefits of scale will follow. But even now, reports just a few weeks ago from ACCA shows that countries that adopt IPSAS are reaping the benefits of having more useful and meaningful information. They're gaining in fiscal credibility, both with their own citizens and also with potential donors or providers of finance, and they're getting more decision useful information. So we would love to see a third column here, private sector, public sector, not-for-profit sector, where we can say, look back and say, well, since we've got our own international standards, these are the benefits that have accrued to the sector: more credibility, more people reading and using useful financial information for decision making, and better flows of cash into the sector. So that's why we're excited about standards. Now, we've looked a bit at the what, or the why, if you like. It would be good to look at the who, of who's behind this project, the IFR4NPO project. So there are two project partners involved. Humentum, we are a membership association based in the US and the UK, but really global. We have members all over the world and staff all over the world. And Humentum, we're very close to non-profit organizations and donors. We have good relationships, strong relationships with those very important groups of stakeholders. And Humentum is convening a practitioner advisory group, bringing input and perspectives from different stakeholders, including non-profit organizations, donors, auditors, and academics from around 16 countries so far. And we've partnered with the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy, which is the only professional accountancy organization in the world exclusively focused on public sector and non-profit accounting. And they are very closely connected to standard setters around the world and the accounting and audit community. So CIPFA is convening a technical advisory group that brings together 13 national and international standard setters. So we can see that together with our two partners, Humentum and CIPFA, and the stakeholders that we're engaging with, we're really bringing a really broad range of perspectives to this project, which is really important. As you can see, it's by the sector, for the sector. It's not being done by somebody on behalf of the sector. There really is an involvement throughout. I should also mention that the International Accounting Standards Board, the IASB, act as official observers on the technical advisory group. So much as they're not leading on this project because they decided it was outside their scope, they are very much aware and very much watching what's going on, which is great. And we're very delighted to have them on board. So I mentioned that Humentum and CIPFA have convened these advisory groups. So you can see the pictures here. There's the tag. That was a picture from our first physical meeting in October. With COVID, we've now changed those meetings to being online, but they're very, very active. We're meeting roughly once a month at the moment, in reviewing papers and bringing technical expertise from all over the world. And the PAG, the Practitioner Advisory Group, this photo is from our first physical meeting, which was in Nairobi in December. And likewise, we're now changing to our online meetings, but very actively involved, very committed and passionate group of professionals who are giving really of their time voluntarily. They're not staff. This is something that they're doing because they're keen to have a positive contribution to the sector. So we're very proud to have those stakeholders on board. So in addition to our advisory groups, we're engaging stakeholders, other stakeholders, such as yourselves, all over the world. So we have people signing up, registering their interest in the project. They can sign up for newsletters or to join this online forum that we have and engage. And so far we have registrations and interest from people in over 80 countries and growing and counting. And we're also engaging country champions in certain focus countries so that we can have regional level influence as well. And so far we've got 12 country champions appointed. We're looking to get, I think, 20, 25 altogether. So even though we only launched in July, we're moving along quite well, and so far the stakeholder engagement is growing, and we're looking for more. We really want to engage people all around the world so that as this guidance is developed, it incorporates the perspectives and priorities of people from all over the world in different regions, different language groups, different contexts. And the idea is that once the guidance is developed, by then there'll be enough buy-in that it can actually be adopted. We could do it very quickly if we just had a couple of people sitting in a room doing it by themselves and then give it to the world, but then we wouldn't have the buy-in, we wouldn't have that richness of contributions and perspectives, which is so important to making this project successful. Let me tell you a bit about the development process. So we've talked about the people involved. If we look at the how, so there's sort of 3 phases to the development of this guidance. The first stage is really a sort of consultation phase, where we are developing a consultation paper right now that will be ready to be launched in January 21. And we're looking to get responses and lots of feedback and input from that consultation paper. It sets out specific issues and alternatives and asks for feedback. And Karen is shortly going to take us through in a lot more detail really what's in that consultation paper. The feedback from the consultation paper feeds into phase 2, which is kind of design phase, where we'll be drafting the draft guidance, if you like, writing the draft guidance based on all that data, and that will be issued for public comment in April 23. And then the final phase is this finalization and launching of the guidance, so that different countries and donors and jurisdictions can choose to adopt it if they wish to, or align to it if they over in the long term, like IFRS. So really the guidance itself is the beginning, if you like. The benefits of it will be felt when it's widely adopted and used. And that's really why there are 2 key aspects to this IFR4NPO project design. So one aspect is the technical rigor applied in the guidance development process, having these national standard setters and CIPFA with their fantastic technical rigor. The other side of the coin of the project design process is this stakeholder engagement, reaching out to regulators, reaching out to national professional accountancy organizations, donors and non-profit organizations during the development process, so that once the guidance is issued, there's a readiness and a willingness to adopt it. And that's really where these longer term benefits will come in when we have a wide scale adoption, that is from 2025 onwards. So I hope that's given you a bit of a background, a bit of the why, the challenges, the solutions, a bit of the who is behind this project, and some of the how. And I'd like to hand over now to Karen, who's going to tell us a bit more about the consultation paper, which is that first phase. Karen, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sam, for that. And we'll sort of now, as Sam has said, talk a bit about the consultation paper. And as you have seen, the consultation paper is in many ways the forerunner to a draft of the guidance. And that guidance will be issued as an exposure draft in the next phase. So the consultation paper is asking very important questions which will help us develop the draft guidance. So this is a critical phase for us. But I wanted to take the opportunity now just to kind of familiarize you a little bit with the consultation paper and talk about what it's likely to cover. But I think I just want to give a sort of a note of caution just to start with, to say that this consultation paper is still being developed. We're in June now, and we're not due to issue to January 2021. So there's still some more development to go through, but I can give you a really good feel for how we think is expected to look. The preface is going to be an important part of the document, because it will set out the objectives of the project, and it will also tell you how you can respond to the consultation paper if you want to do that. It will also tell you the different parts of the document, so it will help you navigate it. So that the preface is going to be fairly central to being able to use the whole document. But the other 2 key sections are part 1 and part 2. This is going to have the guts of what is in the consultation paper. Part 1 will cover what I would characterize as framework issues that are relevant to general purpose financial reports. And I'll say a bit more about this in the subsequent slides. But here we're trying to go to not the specific accounting issues, but things that kind of characterize financial reporting across the sector. In part, in part one, there will be what we call general matters for comment. So we will be posing a number of questions as part of the discussion in there, on which we'll be seeking your feedback. In part two, we will be talking about sector-specific issues. So here we're getting a little bit more into the nitty-gritty of the accounting. And we'll describe how we came about the issues that are included in the consultation paper. And the paper itself will discuss a number of these issues. And again, we'll be looking through specific matters for comment for your feedback on some of the things that we've been thinking about as part of the development phase. We will be providing a glossary. So this will set out the key terms that we've been using in the document. So, and that will apply across the whole of the consultation paper. They might not align. So terms that we're using in the consultation paper may not align definitionally to perhaps what you use in your jurisdiction, because we're aware that different jurisdictions have different definitions. So we're trying to, through the glossary, create a standard set of terms that we're using for the purpose of the consultation paper, so that everyone can take the same meaning from what's there. Sam made an important point in talking about the path to the consultation paper, and that's about the status of the guidance. I think in common with every other international accounting standard, the guidance will be non-mandatory. So because you're an NPO doesn't mean that you have to use it. What it means is that each jurisdiction will need to decide whether it wants to adopt the guidance, and if it adopts it, how it wants to do it. And so I think in looking at what we're proposing in the consultation paper, it's important to kind of have that as a lens, and also that we are looking at something that has international applicability. So that's going to be a challenge for us, because obviously there are some things that are jurisdiction specific. So just to recap on this slide, in responding to the consultation paper, there'll be questions in part 1 and 2. And the instructions on how you will do that will be in the preface to the document. Clearly, we would love everyone to respond to every question that's in the document, but you don't have to. And the way that we have set this up is to allow people to respond to the things that they feel that they can contribute most to. Okay, the next slide, please, Tim. So just talking a bit more about part 1, I think, as I said, this is addressed at the kind of landscape levels and dealing with the framework issues relevant to general purpose financial reports in the non-for-profit sector. So we'll be looking at things like, well, what do we mean by an NPO? How do you know if you're an NPO? And that's recognizing that the range of entities that could potentially be in scope for the guidance is pretty huge. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. But there's also then, well, if you are an NPO, does the guidance apply to you? So who are we intending it for? So we will have some discussion about that as part of the document too. We'll be looking at the users of NPO financial information. Who are they? What do they want? And the role of accountability and decision making as part of that conversation. Because if we are producing guidance that is to deliver general purpose financial reports or statements, we need to have clearly in mind, what do people want from those? So that's going to be important considerations. We also need to look at the features of financial reporting that mean that they're going to be suitable for international accrual-based guidance. So what's going to give us success here? And we need to think about the context for that too. And the part one will also look at the suitability of other international frameworks that are already there. So Sam has talked about IFRS and IPSAS as frameworks that are out there. There is also IFRS for SMEs. And this section of the document will look at those international frameworks and say, you know, would they form a good basis for NPO guidance? And there'll be a discussion around that in the document. Can you move on to the next slide, please, Tim? So now we want to hear from you and just to think about your views about what you think is needed in guidance. If we're trying to frame some of these issues to work internationally, what things do you think are important to make that successful? And hopefully we're going to launch a poll in a second that you can respond to. And we're interested to know is which of the issues that we've listed there do you think are important to know about as part of the guidance? And you can tick all of them if they apply. So please respond to that. If you think there are other things that are important, if you could put those in the chat, that would be very, very helpful. I'll just give you a bit of time to put your responses in, and hopefully we'll all then see the result of the poll. If you could put your response in and hit submit. So are we seeing the poll responses? Hopefully we can share those with you in a second. Here we go. All right, okay, so it's interesting to know that there's importance attached to some of those, but the ones that are standing out as being most important are which stakeholder needs will be met, and that is critical for us because there is no point to general purpose financial statements or reports if they're not meeting the needs of stakeholders. So it's good to see that one out there. And also you've commented in here about how the guidance fits with current international standards. And that is also really important, particularly if you are in a jurisdiction where you're part of a framework that is adopting and using international standards, to know how those fit together. And I think also from the points that were raised earlier about comparability, the more common standards that are being used, obviously the easier that becomes. So I think it's really interesting to see your responses there. If you'd like to talk a bit more about this and share your views, there's an opportunity to do that through the forum that's on the IFR4NPO website. So please do take the opportunity to do that if you are interested. Tim, could you move us on to the next slide, please? So I said that I would talk about NPOs. So if you could click through to the first block, please. And I said that NPOs are diverse, and they surely are. I mean, the nature of NPOs or potential NPOs is huge. You've only got to look at what we see in society, whether that's through humanitarian aid, whether that's through a community-based support organisation, churches, education, some health services, advocacy groups, membership organisations like the one that I belong to. The range and type of organisations is massive. And alongside that is where they operate as well. So Some are very small and operate only in local communities, whereas some are absolutely huge and operate in many jurisdictions. And that goes to funding as well. So, funding can come from the local community, or it can come from big donors. So the range and diversity of organizations is absolutely massive. And as you can imagine, that is a really big challenge for us in finding guidance that's going to work for many of the organizations that could fit in this sector. I think the other thing that we're conscious about in terms of diversity is the legal status of NPOs across the world. In some jurisdictions, NPOs can have legal status. In others, they might be registered as a charity. In others, they may be sitting on the fringes of the public sector in terms of being a non-government type organisation or a trust of some kind. So the whole legal framework for these is very diverse as well. So there's quite a big challenge there in terms of how we deal with that diversity to kind of say, well, who do we mean when we're talking about NPOs? Grab the next box, please, Tim. So what we have been thinking, we've been thinking about this for a while, and we have come to the conclusion, or this is where we've got to so far, is that it's very difficult to have a single definition that is going to cover all of those organizations. So our current thinking is that we will adopt a characteristics type approach. And with a characteristics type approach, we will say that if you meet these kind of characteristics, it's more than likely that you might be an NPO. And that might mean that you're more of one and less of another, but they're going to be there. And the characteristics that we've looked at is, well, why are you operating? What are your primary objectives? And what we're saying is, or our current thinking is, that if you're there to provide services to the public for social purposes, and when I say public, it might not mean the general public at large, it might be for a smaller group, but your reason for being is about for social purposes rather than for financial return. So that's the first one. The second one is about where do you get your money from? And our thinking is that if you derive a significant amount of your revenue from voluntary sources, then you're more likely to be an NPO. And you'll see the word non-exchange there, and that word non-exchange, if you're not familiar with it, is one that we're going to be using quite frequently as part of this project. And by non-exchange, what we mean is that you give money to an organization, but you don't directly get benefits in return that are of equal value to whatever you have donated. So there is no, it's not like a commercial transaction where you go into a shop and you pass over cash and you get a box of cereal or something in return. That is an exchange transaction because you get something of equivalent back. We're talking here about non-exchange transactions where you don't get something of equivalent value back. And the third characteristic is about that if there are any surpluses generated through activities, these are used to further the entity's primary objective, those social benefits. Surpluses are not generated to return money to investors or funders. So we're saying that those three characteristics are the things that we think that if you're hitting all of those either in full or partially, they're most likely to mean that you are an NPO. And finally, applicability. So here we're saying that we're not trying to define who this is going to be used for. Our expectation is that it's not likely to be very small micro entities that might be doing things on a cash basis. We're looking at accruals-based organizations that need some guidance and have finite resources. And because of the issues we're tackling, it's likely to deal with most of the things that they're concerned about. But our intention is not to limit this. So if there are things that in the guidance that are useful, then anybody can use it. And as I've said before, each jurisdiction will make the decision about whether it wants to use the guidance or not. Have the next slide, please. So specific accounting issues, that's what will be in part 2 of the document. And here we'll be looking at how did we go about developing a list, and we'll talk about the previous research that we've used and input that we've taken from national standard setters and from our advisory group. And we've kind of compiled these into a list, as you will see. And because we are not able to deal with all of the potential issues in the first set of guidance, we've also set out some criteria about trying to prioritize the ones that we think are going to have most benefit for NPO organizations. So the 4 criteria we've used are prevalence, is it common across the sector globally? Consequence, is it going to be important for accountability and decision making? Demand, do preparers and the other stakeholders really want this? And then the final one is about feasibility. Is it possible to actually develop a technically sound solution within a reasonable time frame, given what we're trying to achieve in the project? So we'll be seeking feedback on whether we've captured all of the issues and whether the criteria are appropriate, so that we are making sure we're focusing on the highest priority issues. And what you can see on the slide in front of you is examples of the kinds of issues that we are thinking about. And they go to kind of revenue type items, expenditure items, things that form presentational issues in the accounts, including narrative reporting. We'll also be talking about non-financial assets, particularly where things are held for social purposes, not for a financial return. So that includes tangible assets and inventory. And we'll also be talking about a reporting entity. So what is a reporting entity as far as NPOs are concerned? And in particular about agency relationships. So what is an NPO responsible for where it is doing something on behalf of somebody else? So there are a number of things to look at there. And we're going to come to a poll again, if I can move on to the next slide. But before we launch the poll, we want you to express some views on 4 examples of issues there. And we're interested to know whether you think those issues are relevant to you or not. And there'll be a scale on them. But just before I go into that, I'll just give you kind of some examples of the types of issues we're thinking about and why it might be relevant. So on narrative reporting, we're looking at, well, should there be a framework? Is consistency of NPO narrative reporting important for stakeholders? What should be included? Some discussion about ratios. Should ratios be a requirement for narrative reporting? And if so, should we define what those ratios are? In terms of donations in kind, so just thinking specifically about gifts in kind for a minute, if you're provided items of inventory, should these be recognised, particularly if you're passing them on to somebody else? If you've got lots of low value, high volume stuff that you're holding for resale, when should you recognize those, and how do you measure it, and what kinds of disclosures would you make? On expense classification, there's the question about how do you best represent expenses for an NPO? Is it nature of spend? Is it function of spend? What should be in the financial statements? Should there be consistency across the sector? And on the last one, in terms of cash transfers, what happens if the donation that you've given is for a specific purpose, When do you recognise it? If there are any stipulations attached to it, what happens if you only get cash on a reimbursement basis and there needs to be an audit? When do you recognise it then? What happens if you have to repay the donation in certain circumstances? When do you recognise it? So you can see that there are challenges in all of those boxes. We're now just going to launch the poll, and if you could kind of quickly tick whether you think those issues are relevant to you or not, that would be great to get your feedback. So the poll should be in front of you now. So for each of those four, is it not relevant, no issues, minor issues, problematic, very problematic? So number 1 is narrative reporting. Number 2, donations in kind. Number 3, expenses classification. And number 4 is cash transfers. If you could tick each of those and submit it, that would be fantastic. Okay. Okay, Tim, are you able to share the responses from the poll? Just waiting for those to come in. Someone having a problem with the poll, but okay. I might just move us on in the interest of time, but we will certainly come back. Here we go. Okay, so narrative reporting. That's bordering between minor issues and problematic. Okay, interesting to see that. Similarly, on donations in kind. And much more problems around expenses classification. That's really interesting to see that. And cash transfers also problematic or very problematic. So it looks like from the responses that you're giving us that we are talking about topics that are relevant to you and important as we go through. And like with the part 1 issues, if you've got more things that you would like to share on those, I would encourage you to log on to the forum and share the kinds of issues that you are encountering, so that we can think about those as we develop the rest of the consultation paper. Could I just move us on, please, Tim? And next button, please. So I'm just going to talk you through what you might see in the consultation paper, and I'm just using cash transfers as an example here. Firstly, you'll see a description of the issue, and so that hopefully we're describing in here what we're trying to address, the problems that we think are being faced by the sector. Next button, please, Tim. We'll then move on to then setting out what do we think the financial reporting challenges are that are associated with those issues. So why is it difficult to do the accounting for that? So in the case of cash transfers, you know, what are the recognition issues attached to stipulations or to performance obligations and presentational issues too. Next button, please. We'll also be describing in here what existing guidance is already out there. That will include both what's in international guidance, but we'll also be providing some examples of what's in national guidance. So some national standard setters have used IFRS for SMEs, IFRS or IPSAS to develop national guidance, and we'll share some examples of that as well to see how they are using it. Next box, please. And then we'll also be including some alternatives. We're not intending to set out how we think we should tackle each issue now. what we're intending to do is set out a number of different approaches that could be adopted. And because we're only going with approaches at this point in time, you won't see worked examples, but what you will see is what we've noted as disadvantages or advantages of each of the alternatives as we've understood them. And final click, please, Tim. We'll then be asking a number of questions in there around, have we got the issue right? Are there any other alternatives we should consider? Have we got the advantages and disadvantages right? You know, what other information do we need to know? So there'll be a number of questions on each topic to draw that more out in full. Next slide, please. And I think, as I've said to you earlier on, the accounting issues are under development. On our website, we have shared some information on there about each of the issues that we're currently thinking about. These may or may not be the issues that end up in the final guidance, but they're the ones that we're looking at right now. And we would encourage you to go and take a look at those and to contribute to the discussion around those issues by logging onto the forum and having your say. Because we would be delighted to hear what you have to say about those. That's all I wanted to say at this point, so perhaps I can hand back over.
Thank you so much, Karen. That's been fantastic to do a bit of a deep dive into that consultation paper and get a sense of how people can be engaged, the types of questions that will be asked and how we can respond. So thank you so much for that. So we've got a few more minutes. I'd love us to take 2 minutes maybe just on this question. I'd love to hear from you. If there was one thing that you hope that this IFR4NPO guidance could change, what would it be? What's the one thing that you hope this guidance can achieve? And if you have any other questions or comments, please pop them in the chat now so that we can have some chance to address them. Let's give you a minute or so. Don't be shy. To ensure that donors have the same reporting guidelines. So this issue that actually one of the most significant users for an NPO is the donors, and they have a lot of influence and power over the types of reports that they're able to request. I should mention that there is a complementary project called Money Where It Counts, which is looking at harmonizing donor reporting formats, which are for a specific project, for a specific period, maybe according to a specific set of budget lines. And that's kind of complementary to this IFR4NPO project. That project is looking to this project to see some pointers for the big picture direction and definitions and guidance. So that's going to be hopefully a really good knock-on effect of this. One set of rules and guidelines for all, rather than different ones for everybody. Wouldn't that make life easier? And a reduction in the time and effort spent justifying, I've been in these shoes as well, having arguments with auditors. No, I want to do it this way. No, I want to do it this way. Which way is right? And this is something that we can all refer to. We don't need to be reinventing the wheel every set of financial statements. Brilliant. So thank you so much for those one things you could change. That's great. Let's go to the next slide, which is really how you can be involved yourselves. So there's a few ways. Karen has already mentioned the online forum, and we'd love you to register there. It's basically an online chat function or an online conversation. There are different conversation threads. You can share your opinions, your perspective, your concerns. And there's different conversation threads. You can be within one particular conversation. There's a general forum as well for more general comments. You can meet other people in the sector who are also interested in what is honestly quite a niche interest area, but you can meet other people from around the world and see opinions from other places. So please do have a look and join in there. We'll put the links The links are in this slide deck. I'll also add them in the chat in a minute. The other thing is just to visit the website, www.ifr4NPO.org. I'll put that in the chat right now. It just launched this month or last month. We're very, very delighted with it. There's lots of wonderful information there. And obviously once this consultation paper is launched next January, that will also be the place to go to so you can read all these documents that we're preparing now and submit your responses. There's a newsletter which is every couple of months or so. Please do subscribe to that so you can just keep up to date with how things are going. There'll be events that you get invited to, mostly online events, but they will often have a country level or regional level focus. The other way you can be involved is just by demonstrating your support. As we've said, this project is by the sector, for the sector. And to be able to get funding, we need to be able to demonstrate that people want this and people are behind the project. So if you're able to share your organization's logo with us, there's a link there again, how to do that. And obviously the most important thing for you to be involved is to share your answers to the general and specific matters for comment in the consultation paper. It should be, I really want to clarify actually that in the online forum, that's more of a conversation. It's not a formal submission of your answers to questions or your opinion. That really is through the consultation paper. And it's going to be done in a structured way. There'll be a lot of detailed analysis done on those responses. So please do look out for that. And we really would love to have your advice and opinions on that. Let me also put the links in here. So questions, yeah, so let's, if you have got any further questions or comments, please do, if you'd like to, you can just raise your hand or unmute and ask on video, or you could type it in the chat. We'd really love to hear your thoughts or your responses to what you've heard and how you feel about it. Looks like everybody's gone very quiet. That's fine. So maybe it just remains for me to say a huge thank you to each of you for showing up, for turning up today. Thank you so much. Please spread the word. Please share information in your networks. We're also on LinkedIn and Twitter if you are on those, and you can follow us there. Thank you so much to Tim Boyce-Watson, despite for handling our PowerPoint deck, and to Karen Sanderson from SIPFA. You hope people will engage when it's such a long-term plan. Agnes, that's such an important point, isn't it? People, we like quick results, but this is a long-term game, just like IFRS and IPSAS were, and we will do our best to try and maintain the engagement and the energy. So thank you so much, everybody. We'll be sending a follow-up email with this slide deck, with the links and other ways to engage. So we look forward to keeping in touch with you. Thank you so much, everybody. Bye-bye.